We don't have to provoke World War III over Taiwan. That's a long, complicated issue, but this would be the stupidest thing for my grandchildren to die for imaginable. And I resent it every day because for 40 years I've read essays on all of the choke points in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the Indian Ocean against China. That's our policy, choke points. Look at the Malacca Straits. Look what we can do here. First island chain. This is American strategy. Can we?
大家好，欢迎来到正经脉动。今天我想和大家分享一场关于中国的精彩辩论。对阵的双方，一位是哥伦比亚大学的杰弗瑞·萨克斯教授，另一位是芝加哥大学的约翰·米尔斯海默教授。在这段对话中，我们将听到两种截然不同的世界观的激烈碰撞。米尔斯海默教授作为进攻性现实主义的创始人，首先就抛出了他一以贯之的核心观点：美国必须遏制中国。他认为，中国是美国霸权最严峻的挑战者，而联合相对较弱的俄罗斯去遏制正在崛起的中国，是唯一符合美国利益的战略。但萨克斯教授则针锋相对地提出了一个完全相反的结论。他说，中国根本就不是一个威胁。接下来，米尔斯海默系统性地阐述了他的大国政治悲剧理论，解释了为什么在他看来，中美之间的权力斗争是不可避免的。而萨克斯教授则从核时代的现实出发，对这套理论提出了致命的挑战。一边是冷酷的基于权力斗争的现实主义，另一边是呼吁理性和审慎的合作主义。他们的思想交锋将帮助我们更深刻地理解当今世界最重要的两大国家关系，其内在的紧张和未来的走向。好，让我们一起来听听这场精彩的对话。
In terms of China, I'm fully in favor of containing China.
Okay, so containment check.
Yeah. It's containment. I'm not interested in regime change. I'm not interested in trying to turn China into a democracy.
Not going to happen, yeah.
Not going to happen. We tried it, actually, and I thought it was foolish to even pursue a policy of engagement toward China. With regard to Russia, I don't think Russia is a serious threat to the United States, and indeed, I think the United States should have good relations with Putin. It's a remarkably foolish policy to push him into the arms of the Chinese. There are three great powers in the system: the United States, China, and Russia. China is a peer competitor to the United States. It's the most serious threat to the United States. Russia is the weakest of those three great powers, and it's not a serious threat to us. If you are playing balance of power politics and you're interested, as the United States, in containing China, you want Russia on your side of the ledger. But what we have done, in effect, is we have pushed Russia into the arms of the Chinese. This is a remarkably foolish policy. And furthermore, by getting bogged down in Ukraine and now bogged down in the Middle East, it's become very difficult for us to pivot to Asia to deal with China, which is the principal threat that we face.
I think David, could I just say, two-thirds right, perfect.
So you gave him a B or B plus?
A minus.
I'd always give him an A minus.
Oh, that's that great inflation?
I just wanted to add a footnote, which is that China's also not a threat. It's just not a threat.
Well,
I mean,
we're going to get to it.
China's a market. It's got great food, great culture, wonderful people, a civilization 10 times older than ours. It's not a threat.
Well, as an economist, can you talk about the impact of a cold or hot conflict with China from an economic perspective, given the trade relationship?
Yeah, it would wreck California, for one thing. It would destroy the economy that you guys are making completely. This economy has been the biggest beneficiary of China's rise probably in the whole world. So it's crazy. Maybe if you're really worried about whether a worker in Ohio has a particular job on a particular assembly line, then you can be anti-China. If you're worried about the tech industry, about California, about peace and the future, you should be pro-China. That's all.
So why has it become so universal to assume that we are already in a state of conflict with China on not just party lines, but like almost any spectrum you could kind of like consider.
Because John said it exactly right, and he predicted it better than anyone in the whole world in 2001. He said, when China becomes large, we're going to have conflict, because that's John's theory. And it's right as a description of American foreign policy, that we are for power, they are big, therefore they're an enemy. They're an enemy of our aspiration to global hegemony.
Two cities trap,
Well, let's let John jump in here.
Do you want me to? Is it okay if I talk about this?
Yeah. I mean, I think that what's interesting. I mean, you and Jeff, I think, arrive at similar conclusions about Ukraine, but different ones on China, right? Because Jeff is an economist, and I think sees the world in fundamentally positive some ways based on the potential for trade, economics, basically. Whereas you see the world as more of a zero-sum game based on the balance of power. Why don't you just explain that difference?
Okay. It is very important to emphasize, as David was saying, that Jeff and I agree on all sorts of issues, including Ukraine and Israel-Palestine. But we disagree fundamentally, as he just made clear, on China. And let me explain to you why I think that's the case, and then Jeff can tell you why he thinks I'm wrong. It has to do with security, whether you privilege security or survival, or whether you privilege prosperity. And economists, and I would imagine most of you in the audience, really care greatly about maximizing prosperity. For someone like me who's a realist, what I care about is maximizing a state's prospects of survival. And when you live in an anarchic system, and in IR speak, that means there's no higher authority, there's no night watchman that can come down and rescue if you get into trouble. And this is the international system. There's no higher authority. In that anarchic world, the best way to survive is to be really powerful. As we used to say when I was a kid on New York City playgrounds, you want to be the biggest and baddest dude on the block. And that's simply because it's the best way to survive. If you're really powerful, nobody fools around with you. The United States is a regional hegemon. It's the only regional hegemon on the planet. We dominate the Western Hemisphere. And what China has begun to do as it's got increasingly powerful economically is translate that economic might into military might, and it is trying to dominate Asia. It wants to push us out beyond the first island chain. It wants to push us out beyond the second island chain. It wants to be like we are in the Western Hemisphere. And I don't blame the Chinese one bit. If I was the national security advisor in Beijing, that's what I'd be telling Xi Jinping we should be trying to do. But of course, from an American point of view, this is unacceptable. And we do not tolerate peer competitors. We do not want another regional hegemon on the planet. In the 20th century, there were 4 countries that threatened to become regional hegemons like us: Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union. The United States played a key role in putting all 4 of those countries on the scrap heap of history. We want to remain the only regional hegemon in the world. We are a ruthless great power. We never want to lose sight of that fact. And the end result of this is you get an intense security competition between China and the United States. And it revolves around the concept of security, not prosperity.
I think
just very quickly. So what you see beginning to happen is that it's in all domains where the competition takes place, especially high tech. We do not want them defeating us in the high tech war. We are competing with them economically. We are competing with them militarily. And this is because the best way to survive is for us, the United States of America, to be the only regional hegemon on the planet.
So, Jeff, let me set it up for Jeff here. So, Jeff, you and John, I think, agree that the game on the board is power seeking. I think what John is saying is there are smart ways and dumb ways to pursue power. Containing China is a smart way. What we're doing in Ukraine is a dumb way. Whereas it seems like you're saying that all power-seeking behavior is bad. That's not the game we should be playing. We should somehow opt out of that. Is that kind of where you're going?
It's not a bad way to say it, but I would put it in another way. I read a very good book John's. And John described, I'm going to quote him, but he can quote himself afterwards. He said that the regional hegemons don't threaten each other, actually. Why? Because we have big ocean in between. I deeply believe that China is not a threat to the United States. And I deeply believe the only threat to the United States, period, in the world, given the oceans, given our size, and given the military, is nuclear war. I deeply believe we're close to nuclear war because we have a mindset that leads us in that direction. We have a mindset that everything is a challenge for survival and that escalation is therefore always the right approach. My view is a little bit of prudence could save the whole planet. So why I don't like Ukraine is that I don't see any reason in the world that NATO has to be on Russia's border with Ukraine. I was, as I said, Gorbachev's advisor and Yeltsin's advisor, and they wanted peace and they wanted cooperation. But whatever they wanted, they did not want the U.S. military on their border. So if we continued to push, as we did, we would get to war. John explained that better than anybody. We're now at war, and even this morning, there is further escalation. Blinken has said, well, if the Iranians give these missiles, then we will give missiles to hit deep into Russia. This is a recipe. And then we had Bill Burns, the CIA director, say last week, an absurdity that he knows, but CIA directors never tell the truth. If they do, they lose their job. But he said, don't worry about nuclear war. Don't worry about saber rattling. My advice to you is worry a lot about nuclear war. And so be prudent. You don't have to put the U.S. military on Russia's border, okay? And my advice to Russia and to Mexico, and I'm going to Mexico tomorrow, I'll give them a piece of advice. Don't let China or Russia build a military base on the Rio Grande. Not a good idea for Mexico. Not a good idea for Ukraine. Not a good idea for Russia. Not a good idea for China. Not a good idea for the United States. We need to stay a little bit away from each other so that we don't have a nuclear war. By the way, I do recommend another good book, and that is Annie Jacobson's Nuclear War, A Scenario. It takes 2 hours to read. The world ends in 2 hours in the book. And it's a very persuasive guide that one nuke can ruin your whole day, as they say.
Jeffrey,
my strong advice on this, therefore, is recognize China, first of all, is not a threat to the United States security. Big oceans, big nuclear deterrent, and so forth. Second, we don't have to be in China's face. What do I mean by that? We don't have to provoke World War III over Taiwan. That's a long, complicated issue, but this would be the stupidest thing for my grandchildren to die for imaginable. And I resent it every day when we play that game. We have 3 agreements with China that say we're going to stay out of that. And we should. And then China would have no reason for war either. China, and then on the economic side, let me just reiterate, because I was asked yesterday and there was some surprise, was it good to let China into the WTO? I said, of course. It enriched all of you, by the way. It enriched me. It enriched this country. It enriched the world, including enriching China. That's normal. Economics is not a zero-sum game. We all agree on that. I believe that security doesn't have to be a zero-sum game either. We can stay a little bit away from each other, and China does not spend its time bemoaning America being a Western Hemisphere hegemon. They don't. That's not their greatest interest, to bring down American power in the Western Hemisphere.
Jeff, what about energy?
Hold on, let's let John respond to this.
Just very quickly, Most of you have probably never asked yourself the question, why is the United States roaming all over the planet, interfering in every country's business? It's in part because it's so powerful, but it's also because it's a regional hegemon, which means we have no threats in the Western Hemisphere, so we are free to roam. The great danger, Jeff, if China becomes a regional hegemon and doesn't have to worry about security
Then
concerns,
they behave like us, yeah.
then they behave like us.
Can't
That's
we do
exactly
better?
right. But my point to you, Jeff, is let's prevent that from happening by preventing them from becoming a regional hegemon. We don't want them to have freedom to roam. You were talking about them putting military bases in Mexico.
Yeah.
That's our great fear.
It's not my great fear. They have no interest in doing so because they don't want to get blown up either. So
They do seem to have a big interest, Jeff, in Africa, India, Russia, and they are.
I'm sorry, say it again.
China has a major
Doesn't
interest.
have military bases there.
Well, they're building nuclear power plants and trade, and they're building debt
That's a big
loads with
difference.
those
I'm all
countries.
in favor of that. Let's go compete that way. I'm all in favor of that.
But Jeff, that's because they're not a regional hegemon yet.
Yeah, if you try to prevent them from being a regional hegemon, we're going to end up in World War III because, as you say yourself, that this can absolutely spill over into war. I don't want it to spill over into war on the theory that maybe someday they behave differently. That's not a good theory for me, that part.
So, John, can we contain China, prevent them from becoming a regional hegemon without directly defending Taiwan? I mean, isn't that where the rubber meets the road?
No, it's not just Taiwan. I mean, one could argue there's sort of three flashpoints in East Asia that you folks should keep your eye on. One is obviously Taiwan, two is the South China Sea, and three is the East China Sea. And I think, David, that the place where a conflict is most likely today is not over Taiwan. I could explain why I think Taiwan is not a serious problem at the moment or for the foreseeable future. The South China Sea is a very dangerous place. We could end up in a war, for sure, even if we did not defend Taiwan. So Taiwan, you don't want to overemphasize. I agree with Jeff that we definitely don't want a war, and we certainly don't want a nuclear war. And he is absolutely correct that there's a risk of a nuclear war if a war breaks out of any sort between China and the United States. Many of us in the audience remember the Cold War, and this was an ever-present danger in the Cold War. But my argument is that this is inevitable, because in a world where you don't have a higher authority and you care about your survival, you have a deep-seated interest, as any state in the system, to be as powerful as possible.
John,
and that means dominating your region of the world.
There is one player on this chessboard that hasn't come up yet, and maybe we could skate to where the puck is going. You know, when you talk about the South China Sea, okay, sure, South Korea, Japan, Australia, all of those major players there, they're just a couple of 100 million people. But then China is in population decline. Xi apparently is self-destructing in terms of trade. Seems like containment's working pretty well there because of all the self-inflicted wounds. But the fastest growing country, the fastest growing economy, the quickest to develop is India. And they seem to have a very pragmatic approach. Hey, they'll buy cheap oil from Putin, and they are their own sovereign country with their own point of view. Would we not be really well advised over the next 10 to 20 years to make that our priority and India's role in this? How do you look at them?
Well, we definitely view India as an ally, right? It's part of the Quad, which is this Rube Goldberg type alliance structure that we put together in East Asia that includes Australia, Japan, the United States, and India. And India is smartly maintaining its good relations with Russia. The Indians understand, like Jeff and I do, that the Russians are no great threat. But from India's point of view, the real threat is China.
Right.
And there are two places where India cares about China. One is on the India-China border up in the Himalayas, where they've actually had conflicts, right? And there's a real danger of war breaking out. The second place, which is maybe even more dangerous, not at the moment, but will be over time, is the Indian Ocean, because the Chinese are imitating the United States. They not only want to be a regional hegemon, they want to develop power projection capability. So the Chinese are building a blue water navy that can come out of East Asia, through the Straits of Malacca, through the Indian Ocean to the Persian Gulf. And once you start talking about going through the Indian Ocean, the Indians get spooked.
Right.
And that's when the Americans and the Indians come together.
Okay, let's think of this from an engineering point of view, if we could. Why are the Chinese developing the Navy? Because for 40 years, I've read essays on all of the choke points in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the Indian Ocean against China. That's our policy, choke points. Look at the Malacca Straits. Look what we can do here. First island chain. This is American strategy. Can we keep the Chinese submarines out of the Pacific Ocean? First island chain, and so forth. So, of course, they react. They're rich, they're going to build a navy so that they can get their oil on which their economy runs. Can we be a little bit sensible with them and decide how we're not going to have choke points, and then we don't have to have a nuclear war, which is really going to ruin our day? That's the point. We can think a little bit. We can understand it from their perspective. We can understand it from our perspective. Deconfliction. By the way, I don't believe India is an ally. India is a superpower. India is going to have its own very distinctive interests, thank you. It's not going to be an ally of the United States. I happen to like India enormously and
we're making our iPhones
admire
there.
their policies, but the idea that India is going to ally with the United States against China, in somebody's dream in Washington, because it's another delusion in Washington, because they should get a passport and go see the world and understand something.
好，萨克斯和米尔斯海默关于中国问题的这场精彩辩论，我们就听到这里。这段对话把当今国际关系领域两种最主流也最对立的观点展现得淋漓尽致。米尔斯海默的观点其实代表了华盛顿最核心的思维方式。他认为，国际政治的本质就是一场无休止的权力斗争。在这个黑暗森林里，任何一个崛起的大国都必然会挑战现有霸主的地位。因此，中美之间的激烈竞争是不可避免的悲剧。而萨克斯教授则代表了另一种声音，他认为米尔斯海默的理论或许能解释过去几百年的历史，但他完全忽略了我们这个时代最根本的一个现实，那就是核武器的存在。在核武器面前，任何大国之间的直接战争都可能意味着全人类的毁灭。因此，传统的权力游戏已经玩不下去了，大国之间必须学会保持距离，通过合作与对话来管控分歧。可以说，这场辩论的核心就是历史的惯性与现实的约束之间的斗争。米尔斯海默看到的是一本循环往复、写满了权力悲剧的历史书，而萨克斯看到的是悬在咱们所有人头顶上的那把核武器的剑。他觉得这把剑随时都可能掉下来，这才是最大的现实。好了，今天就分享到这里，欢迎订阅我们的频道，咱们下次见。